I'm Erin Trochim, and I'm down from Alaska. I get to say that. So I'm a research assistant professor up at the university there. And people ask me what I do, and I joke that I do things. And so I've spent my career now as an interdisciplinary geospatial scientist. That's a good way to put it. So I've worked with engineers quite a bit. I've worked with ecologists and climate scientists. I've translated our work into the policy sphere. I've worked on big geospatial projects, and so that's how I got involved into the Earth Engine community back in about 2017-18. I've worked in the energy sphere to look at pipeline routings and where do you put heat pumps in Alaska and why would you do those things. And so at the end of it, I've worked with a lot of data. And so what do I get asked about a lot? I get asked about data, actually. I get asked about, so I want to do this thing. Cool. And it's really easy to assume that you need a new data set and you need to go to Landsat and you need to process it yourself. And in the work that I do, I try not to do that, actually. I try to always ask myself, is there another data set out there that could fit my purpose? And like I said, I see it through these like variety of spheres. So that's what this work is about, is that when I saw LLMs starting to come on the scene in 2020, I was like, this is going to be the thing that we really need in order to act as this bridging mechanism. And so now that we can all code with AIs and vibe code, wow, that's pretty awesome. But I think that that's just really scratching the surface of what we can do with LLMs. And so I'm taking a big tent approach right now to GeoAI and thinking about strategy. So what we're going to talk about today is this questioning candor. We're thinking about AI-driven frameworks for geospatial data. So we've published a blog post called the Candid Core Framework, and that's what this QR code links to. And so it's a long blog post, but now you get my version of it today, and this is primarily what we're going to talk about. So you can see these pictures that have been taken from forests around the world. And a really good question is, which one of these would be considered a forest in a geospatial data set, and why? So we can look at the eucalyptus plantation in Brazil. We can look at a bamboo forest in Japan. We can look at my backyard, which is the boreal forest outside of Haines Junction, though it looks pretty sparse. And then we can look at an oak savanna near Palma, Portugal. And this sounds like a really easy question. Well, they're all forests. But when you look at data sets, how do data sets describe them as being forests? That is not simple at all. So there was a really nice AGU poster about this. That's a comparison shopper's guide to forest cover change data sets. And they're going to be releasing a peer-reviewed paper this summer going into depth. But that's kind of the issue that we've been thinking about, is that this keeps on coming up in many fields. This comes up in my backfield of like hydrology that I was trained in. Forestry is another great example, but the list just keeps on going on. So we know we need data. How do we find it, and how do we know that it's useful for us? So this is where we came up with this idea of data candor. So we started off with a challenge up on the left-hand side, which is that we have these like definition ambiguities, and geospatial is broad enough that, again, this happens very commonly. So we're going to take a little trip, pitch why we think that data candor is such a big foundational concept. And so we'll look at Landsat's data revolution, which I would call one of the first big concepts, the cloud native catalogs and how that's contributed to these things. But that despite all of these big things, so we have this massive data set catalog, we have these cloud native catalogs making data sets available, awesome, why can't we find data? And so our data candor addresses the need for user-friendly frameworks that enhance the clarity and trustworthiness to know if this data set is going to do what you think it should do. So the TLDR on this is that, yeah, we have a ton of geospatial data. And so I would argue that out of all the fields that I've ever met, this problem is actually most severe for us. And so we call this, like I said, the metadata mirage, the difference between finding data and actually understanding if it's fit for your purpose. So in our Candid Core Framework, we're suggesting a new layer of principles to add on to existing metadata, to provide honest, user-focused information about data quality, limitations, and recommended uses. And where do the LLMs fit into this? Well, of course, we were thinking about, we could have done this a long time ago, and why didn't we? And we didn't do it because it was a pain. How do you standardize something like this? How do you make, we were just talking about ontologies a minute ago, how do you make an ontology about this? Even when we were talking about this, we were talking about like what's exhaustive enough. But this is actually a great LLM problem that allows human-curated evaluative information to sit alongside our technical knowledge. So, what is the Candid Core Framework? Well, let's go take a look. So you can either hit up that QR code or you can go to it afterwards. So it's a GitHub repo, actually. It's a GitHub repo that describes what our new key categories are. And so we talked about things like suitability and limitations. When you go to a data set right now, does it actually tell you what you cannot do with the data or you shouldn't do with the data? It will in the technical documentation, but you have to read that whole technical document. You often have to be an expert, actually, in being able to find that information. Shouldn't this be part of the metadata? Context and definitions, key term definitions. That forestry example is a great one. When you look at a data set, you should have an understanding of how the key terms in that data set are then being applied in that explicit context. It's almost always in the peer review paper if you read it, but again, we're assuming that the person that you want to use your data set is going to read your peer review paper. That is a very interesting assumption, as well, I'll say. And probably my favorite is when we get into the use cases and target users. So when you produce a data set, you're not necessarily, and you're probably not, the target user, and you may not understand all the range of use cases. This information is absolutely key in increasing searchability and also suggestibility using LLMs in finding data. And then we can go into like provenance and relationships, life cycle and access. And so one thing I really appreciated earlier this morning was a discussion about cost to produce data sets. That is really key metadata information that also should be included. So as we're going through this calculation of, do I make a new data set? Do I collect a new data? Or do I use existing data set? This is actually a really key criteria that's going to become more and more important as we move to a more, we'll call it discriminating ecosystem. So you can check out the GitHub repo. There's an example of how we've applied the Candid Core Framework, and I would encourage you to do that afterwards. Okay, cool. So like I said, if we're really thinking about strategy, and I'm saying that we need a new metadata framework to add on, how did we get there? Why am I making this argument? And it seems so simple. Well, I think that's the thing about when we work in geospatial and we're doing information and we're really focused on the latest formats that are coming out in cloud native and a lot of these like I call it like immediate shiny objects. We forget about how we've actually had impact in the past. And so one of the best examples is Landsat becoming an open source data product, which was a massive shift in their business model, and how it took the data set from essentially being very underutilized to now having over 25 billion of direct value. And so there's a really nice report. I encourage you to think about it. But I would say that the second main innovation that happened was the cloud native catalogs. And Simon, thanks for coming today and working on all of this, because I highlight the Earth Engine catalog as being a really stable geospatial cloud native catalog that's been around for a long time. And I created this figure for you because what's really interesting is that they've essentially been in the same format since 2019. So they've been providing like the description of their data sets, their bands, associated documentation that goes along with it. You can have code snippets to directly open the data, which I really appreciate. But still, Simon gets asked all sorts of questions about data. And so although this was a really useful approach, it's definitely time to improve and think about like if data is actually usable. And so I also appreciated when STAC came along, which is an obvious extension and standardization. And so when we think about the Candid Core Framework, we also think about it as an extension to STAC, actually. Okay, so how do we get here? So we knew that we had this problem for a long time, and this became more and more obvious when we started hooking large language models up to our very large catalog of data sets, and so that includes the main Earth Engine data catalog, but also Sampira Roy's here, the community catalog, which Sam runs. And it was still pretty difficult to find data, and we couldn't answer that like really basic question. So we got together before AGU, and we talked about what was missing. What do we get asked all the time? What do I get asked all the time? And we came up with this idea that maybe we just didn't have the right metadata, and that it was understandable why we didn't, actually. And that's because if you're thinking about curating those like types of categories that I was talking about, like I said, it was time consuming. And if you were producing the information and you have a remote sensing background, did you actually have the ability to necessarily like produce all of like those sorts of categories that are in the Candid Core Framework? No, no, you don't necessarily. And in a lot of ways, that's maybe not your role either. And so, but if we're thinking about the catalogs becoming increasingly important, and also this like findability becoming increasingly important, and the ability to use LLMs in this space, then maybe the paradigm has shifted. So, like I said, we've been talking about this metadata mirage. And so we have on one side the data complexity, so we have variable geospatial representation. Data can originate from instruments and our models, and what is right or fitness depends on the purpose. And so we've been living with this application chasm, and it's why I believe most people would prefer to just generate their own new data set rather than use an existing one. Even though that takes often like an engineer, now you have to host another data set yourself, you have all sorts of life cycle issues, blah, blah, blah. So on the right-hand side is this idea of data candor, which is how do we take and relate data quality, inherent bias, known limitations, and use cases with collective community knowledge. And so this is why these big catalogs that have established user bases, they have some idea of what data is being used for, it's natural to see how this idea would bubble out of them, essentially. And that they only have so much time and energy as well, and thinking about the role that they should be playing. So, as an example of this, you can come and test this out yourself. So if you want, you can hit up the awesome Earth Engine community catalog search. And so what's cool about this is that this backs an LLM into both the community catalog and then the Earth Engine main catalog. So we can go back to my original forest data sets. So I told you that forest data sets were a problem. And so I'm actually originally from Canada, and Canada has a ton of forests. And so I started off with the question of, what forest data sets are available for Canada? That's a pretty basic question. But we have to remember that we need to think about a whole bunch of existing connections that are not currently associated in the metadata, which is I've told you that I want a specific administrative boundary, Canada. I haven't told you about any sort of like historical records. I haven't told you if I wanted associated with field measurements. You don't really know what I want to do with the data. I know that the data is probably going to come from a Landsat-derived imagery product, which is true. And from that, the search goes and shows us forest age, wildfire disturbance, forestry land cover, forest harvest disturbance, forest inventory. Awesome. Well, if you're the average user, what does that really tell you? So you knew you wanted to know about forests. Now you have all this information. How much closer are you to answering your problem? You still have a long ways to go. And this is the huge issue that happens day in and day out with our main geospatial data users. And we need to ask ourselves, What characteristic am I actually studying? Do I need to cross political boundaries? Does the data even do that? And what period matters for my analysis? So the Candid Core is meant to document the when and the why, and also the how we developed each data set to better match potential uses. So if I could summarize this, what I would say is that when we move beyond asking, where are the forests, to understand forest context, we unlock new value. And that the question is not if data candor is necessary, it is which organizations will drive this revolution to build our industry. Because I didn't tell you the stories about Landsat becoming open data and the geospatial data catalogs for nothing. I pointed out where in our last 15 years, 20 if we're being generous, some of the big innovation points have happened. And it's really easy to get lost in the technical details. And so this about, can you find your data? Do you need to actually produce a new data set? What would that look like? What would the format look like? Data candor is the beginning of a large conversation to actually building a true geospatial industry that can combine our climate data, our weather data, our satellite data, our all of the crazy vector data that we're producing, and actually figure out, cool, there should be data for what I want to do. And if there isn't, wow, that's an incredible opportunity. So if we know we have intrinsic value for geospatial data beyond traditional applications, what else could we do with GeoAI? And so what do I actually spend my time thinking about? This is what I do. So I'm going to try not to overwhelm you too much, and just give a final high-level example of some work that we've been doing since October. So you could go off in so many different directions, as you're seeing. And we've picked this data candor example as a concrete thing that, as a data provider, you could include in your metadata now, actually. And if you have a data catalog, you could start to implement this right now, actually. And that's why that GitHub repo is so valuable. We've given you the framework to do it. So, awesome. Well, what's the next problem? Well, I alluded to it in the forest. The what characteristic do you want to talk about forests, which is that when we're searching for data and we're using these large language models, but even when we're doing research, a really good question is, what questions are we even asking? And are we often asking a lot of the same questions? And my answer to you would be probably. So that's what this work is about. It's about using this multimodal approach where we started talking in September at Geo for Good about what LLMs could be used for. And we developed a framework, and essentially based on the Midnight framework components of nouns, verbs, future vibes, genesis, we developed this 20 questions of geospatial analysis, ranging from spatial characteristics, through temporal characteristics, through impacts, through generalizability. And I'm not going to show it all to you right now because I've already lobbed a lot at you. But what I want you to take away is that you could take your initial research question and an abstract of existing research, and we can run it through our framework to see, what do questions look like? How many of your questions are hitting into our framework, and can we reframe them using our framework? So that's what I did. So this little app that we built, and it essentially takes 4,000 abstracts that have been published in Earth Engine. We just used that for the last 5 years to concatenate our analysis, and runs it through an LLM to pull out the keywords from the paper, update the keywords using the LLM, a description, a topic label, if it's a phenomenon or a methodology paper, what the original geospatial question was. And so this one, the original question was, what are the patterns of wetland class change across Newfoundland in 1985 to 2015? That's actually a pretty good question. And I tried to pick a good example to show. So when you run it through our reframed one, the most relevant question that becomes more detailed using our framing is, how has the spatial distribution and extent of different wetland classes, bogs, fens, swamps, and marshes in Newfoundland changed between 1985 and 2015? And what are the key spatial characteristics of these changes? And when you use LLMs, the thing that I can tell you is that it doesn't behoove you to be too broad because there are a lot of interpretations of your text when you ask very broad questions, and maybe you want that. But I don't think a lot of the time you do necessarily. You actually want to be more specific. And so how do we add a higher degree of specificity to what we're doing so we can be using these techniques to actually produce the things that we want? And so our framing is really key in making these sorts of technologies work for us. And geospatial is especially a really tricky one. And I like to say this, it's because everybody has this high degree of knowledge about geospatial data. So when Google Earth came on the scene, this is one of my favorite examples, what was the first thing that everybody did with this crazy technology that like showed you the globe? They went and they looked at their house. And so, but it's the challenge of geospatial data is that we have this, like I said, this intrinsic knowledge of how the world looks around us. And so we need to be enabling people when they're using geospatial data to be able to mirror that perception within our use of the technology around them. And so that makes it both very challenging for us, but also incredibly exciting. So with that, there's some related talks to what we've been doing. Simon gave a talk this morning, which now you get to catch up with. If you missed, Sam is talking about cloud native data commons, and he's going to go through the search tool a lot more. That's tomorrow. And Arvin is going to talk about bridging Nerdville and field view at the lightning talk this afternoon. And so with that, I just want to thank my colleagues at Google Research for providing me with an academic research award to conduct this work, all of my collaborators, and we have a little bit of time for questions. So. Awesome, yeah.
One of the challenges with LLMs for labeling is it'll always keep generating new and creative ways to rephrase the same kind of label.
Yes.
Is that something you all have been trying to approach or handle? Do you have in the framework like strict existing topics that it has to classify to, or how do you handle that?
Oh, so we haven't quite gotten there yet. And that's why this questions paper comes up as being kind of key, because in some of this, we're not talking about explicit labels. And if we are, we're talking about it in terms of making sure that there's that definition of terms as part of the metadata. The bigger issue that I've been finding as I look at the keywords that are associated with papers versus us using an LLM to update them is that actually a lot of the original keywords from papers are maybe not as exhaustive or necessarily pointing in the right direction as they could have been. And that's because in our field, this is actually another great example. We tend to emphasize the methodology more. And there's a big emphasis on that period. And so when we actually talk about looking at phenomenon itself, most of our keywords have been around the methodology, actually, if that makes sense. So I think you're looking at a very granular level. And from what we've seen at the little bit that we've been doing at the LLM level, I would argue that its performance is still better than a human overall. And we weren't doing this, so yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and also with this idea, and we talked and argued fairly extensively about this, is that the Candid Core Framework, part of the reason why it wasn't suggested before is that it's a dynamic metadata, actually. The use cases will get updated as more people do more things with it. The limitations will get updated as people look at them and say, well, what about this? And so a lot of these explicit terms, you have to be careful when where and why you use them. And when we're applying them to metadata, we often treated metadata as being a static information source, when actually it's not. It is to some degree, but in this missing data, these are not static data properties, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have kind of comment rather than a question. So I've been helping Erin with this work, but this is pretty much Erin's creation. And as an example of kind of thinking through this, this is a lot of kind of things we can do, but it is hard. One simple thing that I made the change in the CNG catalog after thinking about this and talking through with Erin and others is we did not have categories. We had keywords, but no categories. And so 3 months ago we did not, now we do, because I kind of shamed myself and said, hey, I think categories is a simple thing I can add, just make things radically simpler. And so there are some different, maybe small steps from either data Candor or questions you can extract to immediately enhance your catalogs, your metadata, and so on.
So maybe a very basic question,
Yeah.
but when you say run the data through the framework,
Yes.
are you talking about the data itself or the metadata? Like, what does that look like, actually?
That's a good question. So I can tell you that gets easier and harder depending on how you do it. And so right now, if you want to do it, how would I do it? We actually give you a field reference guide that you can read into an LLM. And Simon did actually put this into an LLM. And he used it to generate a description for the global urban heat island intensity, which is not a real data set, but it's very similar to a real data set, actually. And so it depends. It depends on how long your data has been out there and if the LLM already knows about it. If your data hasn't been out there for a long time, then you're going to have to get more creative. Then you would want to give it essentially like the field guide as the original context. You would give it any technical information that you have, like technical guides. If you have a peer-reviewed paper, I would totally feed it like annotated notebooks that describe how you got to the data, related papers, and it will actually start to populate these categories pretty decently for you. The question is, how good are they? And who's going to evaluate them? That's a whole other story. And the other key part to a lot of this is feeding the existing stack metadata as well to it. So it doesn't, this adds on top of the original categories that are in there. And some of the ones that we've suggested, I've seen suggested in other extensions that have been proposed as well. We just took a much more holistic view at it, and also made the assumption that you could use LLMs to help populate some of these data sets. And like I just talked about as well, that they wouldn't be static entries, they could be dynamic for obvious reasons.
So then is the idea basically you would have this like richer metadata source about the data sets, and if there was enough of them, it would basically help with like more AI agents to figure out what data sets to query and like how for like a generic question or the general question?
Yes, yeah, so you're totally seeing where this is going. So this is why just letting the LLMs alone, like go wild and do this, is maybe not strategic, because I've already laid out like a much more curated strategy for generating it. And then having like some educated people actually look it over and like peer review is very valuable. And by peer review, like I mentioned, should it be the dataset author necessarily? Yes and no. They will know parts of this, but who are some of the other uses? That's where you might not know. You actually might need to go talk to your industry partners, because they actually probably have a much more in-depth understanding of market research, and that's a big key in this. Your data set, like curators may also have some idea about some of these like entries essentially. And so this is probably part of the other challenge, like why this hasn't been done so far, is that it would have been a pain. It would have been a pain because who generates the like first version of this? And so yeah, but if you have this curated and you all have agreement, like community agreement about it, then wouldn't you want an agent, an AI agent to be using this? I would. So, and like I said, for the average user, this is a lot of what they actually need to know. Hey.
Hey, thanks for sharing this framework. I'm Ash from Planet, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on data that's not open and how it could fit into this framework. And it could be either proprietary, like companies, like the one I work at, creating data that I wish more people could have access to. And I think your story of Landsat and how that drove a lot more adoption and usability in applications we didn't previously imagine is a great one, but I'm also curious about, there's also sensitive data that for other reasons beyond just like corporate interests may not be released or truly open, and how do we have this fit into the framework?
Yes, totally. So the two parts. So what if my data isn't open? Well, that's the nice thing about metadata, is metadata doesn't assume that the data is open, and that actually can be a category in and of itself in terms of discoverability. And so I would say for data that's not open, this has probably even more relevance to helping customers find you, actually, and to find your new data sets and products, and also to be, like, especially for the global people, maybe your global data set doesn't work well everywhere. I say coming from Alaska, where we check this out on a regular basis. This is a really helpful thing to include in your metadata. And that's what this framework would help you do. And so I would say at the heart of it, it doesn't matter if your data is open or not. In terms of sensitive data, I would also say that when I've thought about this, I think having a degree of openness around a lot of these categories is really valuable. But for any company, you're actually doing a version of this already. I know you are. You just haven't documented it in a framework like this. You don't actually have a way to intersect it into an open framework. So that's part of the other problem, is that there will be a version of this that does exist already. And as a technical expert, the biggest problem is that one of the best versions exists in heads like mine. And we just don't tell you unless you happen to catch me in a good day where I have time and the bandwidth, because it isn't my job is the problem. So I would say about some of the sensitive data, it's worth being creative about it actually, and thinking about, because I deal with a lot of this as well actually. Yeah. We should talk about how to be creative about it afterwards. But to answer your question, for data that's not publicly distributed, does it matter? No, I don't think it does actually. The other thing about this is that, does this just apply to geospatial data? No, it doesn't actually. It applies to a lot of data sets and data in general. It's just that where does it have its greatest ability to have high impact? I would actually argue in, like I said, in geospatial, because this is such a problem for us. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam. I worked in the community catalog. Worked with Erin on this project as well. To answer the sensitive piece, if there is a sensitive attribute,
Yes, we could flag that.
or a sensitive tag, there is also this concept that they're creating two different versions of the same metadata. Yeah. One acts as your private data store where you can ask the LLM to look into that and give you answers. For example, how many military vehicles were determined on those specific image, or some specific tag that you're very interested in that could be added, which already functions right now because people are already doing that with the models and the model outputs. So I think the nice thing about this is there is that flexibility that if you do have private attributes that you don't want to make public, you can have your own private versions of the metadata itself without breaking the overall structure.
Thanks, Sam. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much.